recording. There we go. So start with chapter 2, and the thing I want you to look for, what I'm trying to do with these readings is give you something to look for when you go in there, right? So in terms of chapter 2, I want you to be able to kind of think about what John Locke means by the state of nature. And since he says that we are in this state of what he calls perfect freedom, is there any law? Because it seems to me that in a state of perfect freedom, there's no law. But that's not quite what he says. I want you to wrestle with that a little bit. When you get to chapter 4 on slavery, the question, and it's a very short chapter, which is interesting. I want you to ask yourself, how does he reconcile slavery with freedom? Because he certainly tries to. And then as a secondary question, why does he do that? I mean, if he's writing as a philosopher, remember the ultimate aim of a philosopher is to establish a generalizable truth. He seems to be saying that a generalizable truth is that even in a liberal or free society, there can be, and he suggests in many cases there must be, slavery. And remember, he's publishing this, he's writing it between 1688 and 1690. It's published in approximately 1690. Obviously, the Atlantic slave trade is booming. It goes, well into the 19th, well, it goes through the 18th century. By the 19th century, slavery is still an institution. It doesn't cease to be an institution in the United States, technically until 1865, really, functionally, either between 1863 and 1865. And there still is the Atlantic slave trade. But so at the time he's writing, slavery is a fundamental component of capitalism. All right. So that's important for us to remember. But when he's talking about the state of nature, he's talking about, as he says, what state ought now, and he'll use the male pronoun throughout. This is the 17th century. I don't want to constantly be held responsible for correcting him to a non-male pronoun, okay? But he says that the state where all men are naturally, okay? And that naturally, if you just look at human beings in nature, we're all free, okay? He refers to this as a state of perfect freedom to order their actions and dispose of their possessions and persons as they think fit, within the bounds of the law of nature. So he implies there, right in the first sentence of chapter 2, you're perfectly free, but there's a law of nature. Now, given that most of you, probably all of you, have not had the chance yet to read this, what possible law could there be in nature? Because remember, we don't have any kind of civil government. We don't necessarily have formal institutions to enforce law. He's a little vague at times about what he means by state of nature, but what possible law could there be? The implication is there is a thing called natural law. Now, this becomes important because the concept of natural law, pretty much from this point on, it's not new with Locke, but from this point on, it becomes pretty fundamental to English common law, which then becomes the kind of law that is extrapolated at least to the American colonies. And it very much informs the creation of the American Republic. What is natural law? What does that mean?
Is that sort of similar to like natural instincts, sort of way, like behavior?
In what way? How would it be? No, religion is not natural. Religion is a creation of human beings. It's not natural. It doesn't occur spontaneously in nature. But what we're looking for when we're looking for law is, what is the source or the guarantor of that law? What guarantees or protects either that people will or will not obey? That's part of the law. So when you say instinct, we didn't really understand all that much in the late 17th century about the difference between instinct and reason, but we had some kind of sense of it, that human beings were these thinking people. But instinct is problematic, because instinct, remember, isn't always reasonable. Now, Jose is suggesting that self-preservation is an instinct. Okay, that's true. I mean, as far as anything is an instinct, the imperative to preserve your own life is instinct. I mean, most of us don't turn toward something that's going to do us harm. We try to avoid it. That's instinctive. That's an instinctive action that we take to preserve our life and our health. Okay, is that the law of nature, do you think? Or I mean, can we really say that instinct is law? Think of it this way. To the extent that Jose is right, and we have this natural instinct to protect our lives, is it then wrong to kill?
So is he talking about some kind of like inherent morality?
Well, let's stick with instinct first. You know, we may discover that, you know, that in instinct there is some kind of what you would refer to, Owen, as inherent morality. But let's just stick with this first question of, if we are instinctively driven to protect ourselves, is it wrong to kill?
I mean, in the video you posted talking about in Locke's state of nature, like he says it's okay to kill the intruder if it's within like the violation of his rights.
Right. In other words, Locke would argue, if you have to defend your life, your health, your property, then yes, in a state of nature, you have a right to kill. And again, he's not saying you have a right to kill a potential murderer. He's saying you have a right to kill a potential intruder. Someone who's just, because the idea being, of course, well, if they're intruding and they get that far, then they're going to take whatever they want, up to and including your life. That's a little thin on the reasoning. We're lucky that overwhelmingly people who take things from people's houses generally don't want to kill anybody, you know. But again, is that instinct that tells us, yeah, you know, I have a right to kill people? Is that just following an instinct? Because then that would suggest instinct is never wrong. Is instinct ever wrong? Is fear an instinct? Is that an instinctive reaction, fear?
Yeah.
Why would you say that it's instinctive?
Well, it's essential to our survival, or at least it was.
Well, it may or may not be. We haven't established that yet. But what's the source of fear? Somebody look up fear in your smart device and tell me, what is fear? What is fear?
Well, without looking anything up, I'm just going to guess it's a reaction, right?
Well, okay, but we want to know more importantly, and you're not wrong. I'm not making fun. I'm just saying, yeah, it's an obvious reaction to some stimulus. Everything human beings is a reaction to stimulus. But what we're trying to figure out is what is the nature of that reaction? What is fear?
Isn't it a feeling of like, it's like an alarm or apprehension to something that you see as dangerous or something that could cause pain?
How do you know it's dangerous? Let me give you an example. Almost everyone has at least one of these. They're called phobias, right? Like mine is rats. I can't deal with rats. I just can't. I've tried and I just don't want to be around them. I don't like nature animals anyway. I think they're a pain in the ass. But rats are funky. And I don't even like mice that much, but I really don't like rats. Okay. Now, some people would say, well, there's something instinctive about that. There's something about them that you find repulsive, and you know, all that is. Now, let's assume that. What is a phobia? Come on, some of you have taken a psych class. What's the difference between a phobia, for example, and other kinds of fear?
Irrational.
It's irrational. It's irrational. Now, how do we know when fear is rational? Is fear always rational? We know it's not because of phobias. We know that there are, and again, it's not necessarily any more intense than the kind of fear we would feel if someone broke into our house. In fact, I'd rather deal with a rat than an intruder, but only just barely, you know, because human beings are the most vicious animals I've ever seen. Rats are just funky, but human beings are vicious. Okay. What I'm trying to get at is fear rational? Or is caution rational? Because the difference might be caution is a learned reaction, right? Once bitten, twice shy. You know, you burn your fingers once, you don't fiddle with the stove again. I literally did that as a kid. You know, I learned the hard way not to take a hairpin and stick it into an electrical socket. I mean, I was always exploring, right? Ever the scientist, always in a constant voyage of discovery. It's amazing that I'm still breathing, okay? But caution, I would suggest to you, is a learned response. It's a response that is learned as a consequence of observing over a period of time some things that appear to cause harm and other things that don't. So caution, it seems to me, if we're going to generalize, I would argue is rational. It's reasonable. Yeah, of course. You know, you've seen this do harm before, or things like it do harm before. You're going to avoid it if you can, because it increases the likelihood that harm is going to be done to you if you get too close to that thing or you fool around with it. But is that the way fear works? Are we reasoning when we're frightened? I don't think we are. It sounds more instinctive. What usually compels human beings to be fearful? What are we afraid of?
Imminent danger of harm.
Well, how do we know we're facing imminent danger of harm, though, Owen? Because most of us, most of the time, aren't really in this constant state of anticipating imminent danger of harm, and yet a lot of us are fearful. What are we afraid of?
Well, some of it's probably, you know, like a learned reaction, like you said.
Why are we afraid of the dark?
Unknown, uncertainty,
Uncertainty. Why do we create institutions?
certainty.
To deal with the anxiety imposed on us by uncertainty, to give us predictability, to explain, here's what's going on, here's what this means, don't worry about it. It doesn't mean, you know, you can do anything you want. It means, okay, I'm much less anxious now because I kind of know what's most likely going to happen here. I know we're tired of talking about the election, but I would use that as an example institutionally and say, there's a higher than normal degree of anxiety in the United States right now, and indeed around the world, as a consequence of the impending election, because of the nature of uncertainty that's been injected into it from a variety of sources, okay? Some of them personal, some institutional, some partisan, whatever, okay? So what I'm going to suggest is that fear at its root is about what we don't know or don't understand, and it will frighten us. Not always, but if something frightens us, I can pretty much guarantee it's because we really don't have a very good understanding of it. That would include phobias as well. In other words, why would you be afraid of a snake? Or why would you, I mean, you know, overwhelmingly snakes are harmless. You know, rats are funky, okay? But, you know, I don't think I've ever been bitten by one. And
Oh, I
yeah,
have. It's awful.
they're funky, and they're, they're squirrels with ugly tails, really. But I'm not afraid of squirrels. I don't like rabbits, but that's just because they're creepy, But you know what I'm saying? In other words, it's kind of irrational because I can't anticipate what a rat is going to do. And I know they can be aggressive, and they are big enough to inflict some pain on you. But also, there's something creepy about them. Why are people afraid of insects? There's not an insect walking the planet I can't step on and kill. Why would we be afraid of them? Because there's something about them that we just don't understand. We don't know what motivates them. We don't know what, if anything, they are thinking. We don't know, really, anything about them. Do you really know what's on the mind of the average black widow spider? No, you're just afraid of them. Okay. And it doesn't even have to be a black widow. It just has to be a spider. If people are afraid of spiders, they're just afraid of them. And it's a paralyzing fear for some people. Okay. The idea is it's that uncertainty that we interpret as danger. Even if we know the likelihood of them hurting us is low, why are we afraid of dead things? Because most people are. Most human beings have a natural revulsion to anything dead, not even just human beings. But even think about that. Why would you ever be afraid of a dead human being? And yet it's really hard for people to approach a dead person or someone they think might be dead. Why are we afraid of that? Because we don't understand it. It's not something that fits neatly in our brains because, again, if you go back 100 years, people weren't nearly as frightened by death. They were concerned about it because of the uncertainty of how much time they had and everything else. But, people dealt with death much more often and as a much more normal part of their lives 100 or 150 years ago than we do now. You could go through your whole life experiencing no death other than your own. It's possible to do that. That's unusual, okay? If you've been around death, if you've dealt with it, all of a sudden it's like, it doesn't make it any less disturbing, but it makes it less frightening. Because you understand, I know what's going to happen now. I know how this works. Okay. So the idea is, if the law of nature is instinct, which is that pull back from fire kind of thing, that doesn't seem to be a very good premise for governing. In other words, that would imply that the rule of governing human beings is fear, which is essentially irrational. The notion of, the limits of our knowledge rather than the application of our knowledge. So that's not really what Locke says. What he argues is the law of nature is that with which we are all endowed by our Creator, which is the ability to reason. That's what governs us, is our reason. And what governs us is law, right? That thing that governs us is what we call law. In this case, he's arguing you've got a built-in mechanism to govern you, which in a perfect state of nature should be all you would need. If everyone was governed by her reason, we would never need any other kind of law, because reason will tell you, it's not reasonable for me to just capriciously go out and physically threaten people or steal their stuff, because then even if I'm just completely selfish, it compromises my own security because it establishes a precedent of behavior that others are going to observe and think, well, if he can do it, so can I. And then next thing you know, no one is secure. But you see, that's reasonable. That's not instinctive. That's someone thinking ahead and thinking, nah, can't do that. As much as I would like, what that person has, if I take it, I'm not secure in my own property. As much as I don't like that person, if I hit him with a stick, what's to prevent someone else from coming and hitting me with a bigger stick? That's reason. That's not instinct. That's us stopping and thinking. It's the capacity to reason. So in the state of nature, then, John Locke is saying, you've all got this built-in mechanism, and it is your capacity to reason. Now, he argues we've been given that by God. because God's the creator of everything. I mean, he's writing from that point of view, right? This is not a completely secular document here, right? In fact, one of the things that might strike some of you, I don't know how familiar most of you are with the, the actual scriptures in the Bible and everything. I suspect most of you are not familiar at all with what's in the Bible. But you'll notice how frequently he is invoking the Bible, okay? And he's suggesting, well, the reasoning for this can be found in the Bible, which is, well, no, it's not the same thing as religious though, okay? Because believing in God doesn't make you religious. It doesn't. Religion is a specific institutional arrangement, that is wrought as a consequence of a belief in a God or gods, okay? Religion is a more formal institution, but belief in God can be just a kind of placeholder for uncertainty so that we can cope with it, okay? And in fact, you can argue to an extraordinary degree that religion itself is not really rational. It's not that it's irrational, okay? But if you think about it, how reasonable is it to believe in, well, no, yeah, Jose, yeah, right. In other words, Locke is saying this capacity to reason comes from God. What I'm saying is there are a lot of people who don't consider themselves religious who believe in a God or gods. Okay, so belief in God is a belief in a creator. Religion involves an institutional arrangement for what your position is in the world as a consequence of that particular God or those gods in whom you believe, okay? It's a more formal arrangement than simply a belief in a God or gods. But if you think about that, how really reasonable is belief in God? And before we get any farther, look, for those of you who are believe in God, I am not questioning your faith. What I'm questioning is the degree to which everything human beings do is reasonable. Even the really important things are not all necessarily reasonable, but they can exert extraordinary influence over our lives. Is a belief in God reasonable, rational?
I feel like it's kind of connected to fear, or like this fear of the unknown. So people rely on religion to kind of comfort them. So in that sense, it's not rational.
Yeah, what it is, I would suggest though, I think people are mistaken, and you're not saying this, but when people say, oh, it's irrational, what I would argue is it's pre-rational. In other words, it's a part of the way human beings behave in that instant before they stop to think, when that intensity of uncertainty really has a grip on them. And so I think that's a good point, that some sense of religious, what we might call religious faith, as opposed to organized religion, might be the thing that gives us a sense of sort of insulation from uncertainty. It may not explain everything, but it kind of gives us something to hang on to in those moments of uncertainty, maybe until we have the capacity to slow down, observe, and reason. It might be that that's an important function of, a belief in a God or a belief in some sort of unseen protection. But it clearly doesn't seem reasonable because it's not subject to any kind of verification. It is not something that you learn so much as that you accept, which is not quite the same thing as learning. Okay. In other words, religion doesn't offer understanding of very many things. That's not its function, if you think about it. Religion, in any notion of religious faith or God or anything else, the key to that is help us with those things we can't understand rationally. Help us out. Give me something that will get me through these periods of uncertainty that every human being goes through in his or her life, right? I mean, we all have those moments when sometimes we think they're minor things, but give yourself some time. They're going to be extraordinary things that you're going to have to deal with. And if you don't have that recourse to that kind of, well, I don't understand what it is that's giving me this reassurance or this sense of calm, but it's there and I'm going to accept it. Okay, that might be what gets you through a really, really, really uncomfortable place in your life, okay, where reason might not suffice for everybody. It's really hard to reason when you're afraid. It's really hard to reason when you're depressed. It's really hard to reason when your emotions overwhelm you. You know, when you're angry, you're not doing your best reasoning. So too when you are afraid or when you're feeling despair, you tend not to be reasoning. Okay. It's why, for example, when you're with your friends and you can see that they're feeling kind of low and they seem a little lower than usual, you just try to get them to talk. Because ultimately, what human beings tend to do when they start to externalize, they start to think about what might be weighing them down. This is the whole argument behind therapy, right? Between, you know, sort of what's sometimes called talk therapy. Just get it out of your system. You will discover a pattern in this. You will discover what's weighing on you. And you will either discover, gee, it's not as heavy a burden as I thought it was, or it's a pretty heavy burden, but now that I understand it, maybe it doesn't create as much anxiety with me. Okay. Well, before you're able to do that, sometimes you need help. Okay. And religion can offer that to people if they're willing to believe. If you are possessed of faith, if you really do, invest your life in trusting that, it can help you. If you don't, though, it can't. It can't. So what Locke is really then talking about with the state of nature is this capacity to think rationally, to reason. Now, again, reason doesn't mean rationalizing something. Well, I have a reason for doing this, and you make something up. It means you really reason through it. You reason from cause to effect. You know, you reason from action to consequence. And you do that before anything has happened. That's what he's talking about. Does that make sense? That's what reason is. It's not just making up an excuse after the fact. It's checking your actions before you do anything that you might later come to discover was undesirable. And so what you're doing is, if reason is working properly, right, you're governing yourself. It's what we do in much of the day. I mean, we spend much of our day just sort of making decisions about what is or is not a good idea. You know, there's a ceiling fan. I'll stick my hand in it just to see what happens. No, I don't think I will. I don't think I will. Okay. Or my car is supposed to go 130 miles an hour. I'm going to go outside and try that right now. You know, it's not really reasonable. You know, it's not a good call. And it's easy for us to do that most of the time, particularly if we're not under any other kind of duress or pressure or anything else. Okay. Well, if you think about it that way, if Locke is right, okay, and there is this kind of state of perfect freedom, you know, from which the species originated, right? And if in that state of perfect freedom, we're all reasonable, why do we need government? Why do we need any other law but our capacity to reason? I mean, we should all be reasonable people. Because you have to think about that before the rest of his philosophy makes any sense. If that's the case, then, you know, if we're all reasonable people, then why don't we just still live in the state of nature? Why do we have all these laws? And, you know, remember we were talking about institutions, right? Why do we have traffic lights? Aren't people reasonable when they're driving? Can't they tell when, you know, obviously anytime you come to some place where you can't see, you stop and you look and, you know, you work it out with people. That's all reasonable. That, you know, can't we do that ourselves?
Everyone has different perspectives of what reasonable is and what common sense is. So you have to have some establishment to tell everyone like what is right and what is wrong.
I don't think you do. I don't see that. I'm trying to argue from Locke's perfect point of view. What if I say, no, I don't think you do? I mean, everyone would agree that it's reasonable not to get in a car wreck, right? Everyone would agree that it's reasonable for everyone getting into their car to make sure that they and everybody else more or less get safely where they're trying to go. And that if you're watching out for yourself and everyone else is too, you're not going to have very many problems. When I started riding motorcycles, one of the first things that somebody told me was every time you throw your leg over that bike and you get out on the road, you ride like people were aiming for you to hit you. Be that defensive and you will not lay that bike down. And the only reason, and riding motorcycles is a very superstitious thing. It's the closest I've ever gotten to superstition. I would never say until I stopped riding bikes that I had never laid a bike down, you know, because it's just that idea. I knew so many guys, I never laid a bike down, and then they go and lay a bike down. And I think part of that is you can get cocky on a motorcycle, and you can actually foolishly trust in other people and abandon your own sense of reason, which is when you're on a motorcycle, you're not as visible. Not only are you not as well protected, people just don't see you. And you learn to do things like make eye contact with other drivers because then they see you. It's funny how human beings react. But the idea there is, I never felt like I could trust the reason of other people. But my reason would determine I'm going to ride in this way. I'm going to ride at these times a day. And I'm not going to go heavy into a blind curve because that's how people die, you know. But it seems to me that ultimately, even driving on a road with unreasonable people, I was able to, you know, keep two wheels up and not get hurt. Can't we do that? I mean, what's wrong with you people? You know? Why are you so unreasonable? Do you really think that human beings just are so powerfully flawed that we can't trust our own reason with them? We can't rely on them to be reasonable?
I think it's like a thing with agreement too, is that we can't agree what's right and wrong sometimes.
Well, again, let's use the driving example. Why would it ever be right to go faster than you could see? How is that reasonable? I think everyone would agree that that's wrong. Now, some people, though, they might not care. They might say, oh, maybe it's not reasonable. I don't care. I wanted to. I want to see how fast this thing would go. Yeah, but there was a school right there. Well, yeah, but still, it was a street, right? Nobody said I couldn't. How often do you hear stuff like that? Well, nobody said anything. No, but man, you should have used your head. That's not cool. You can't do that. So I would suggest it's more than just disagreement over what's right and wrong. Part of it, I would argue, no, reason is not subjective, but self-interest is. Here's the problem with this notion of reason, okay? If you are really reasoning, you're not just thinking about yourself. You're thinking farther ahead than that. Remember the example I used? In other words, if what's stopping me from stealing my neighbor's stuff is only the concern that then people could steal my stuff, you see, I now have to consider other people. Reason commands that I consider other people and how they might react. We do that more often than you might think. Remember, we're social animals. We really are. You know, we're pack animals. We don't do well when we're isolated. That's why so many people are unhappy with this pandemic, is that you feel like you're locked up in your room and you can't get out and socialize. And in my earlier class, there was a student who now how cool is this? Her birthday is Halloween, you know, so every Halloween's going to be cooler simply because it's also your birthday. And she was saying, well, all she could really do is that she went over to somebody's house and there were only like a handful of people. And I guess they didn't do, you know, there's not much you can do, right? But part of that is we want to get out and socialize. Why? Because we're social animals. So we don't do well in isolation. We know that. There's not a single psychological study anywhere that suggests that human beings are at their best in isolation. And any number that suggests that we are close to our worst in prolonged periods of isolation. Okay, with very few exceptions. And so the idea of reason is, if you are a social animal, you've got to think about the potential, you've got to project ahead to the reactions of the society around you to some extent. I don't think it's that hard for us in real basic ways to understand when we're doing right or wrong. I think the challenge is, do you care? You know when you're speeding. You know you're speeding when you're speeding. This whole thing of, gee, I didn't realize how fast I was going, that's nonsense. Either that or you're a crap driver. But the thing is, we know, okay, we almost always know when we're doing something unsafe. We know, we just don't care as often as not. It isn't that we don't think it's wrong, it's that we think we can get away with it. Now, how often do we do that? It isn't about, well, gee, I know this is wrong, but nobody's going to catch me, so the hell with it. Okay? That's kind of flawed reasoning. And that's not a question of disagreement over what's right or wrong. Everyone who kills somebody knows they've done wrong. By the way, I mean, this includes people in combat. There's a part of everyone who knows if they, even if they are ordered to do it, if you take a human life, you know on some level you've done something that you really would like to undo. If you don't, then people are deeply concerned, okay? And so this idea that somehow people just make these adjustments, you know, it's like, well, yeah, I had to kill the guy, but, you know, he was an asshole anyway and he had it coming. That might be what people say, but those things can haunt you because we do agree on a lot of things as being right or wrong. So the challenge is, does our understanding of that and the reasoning that should engender in us, does it always work? No, not if we don't care. Not if we don't care. Not if we don't care about the consequences. Not if we think we can get away with it. And so the idea there is, yeah, we all have the capacity to reason. We have the capacity to understand right and wrong. We don't always exercise it, and we're not always governed by it. That's what Locke is suggesting, really, right? Oh, that's okay, Hannah. I'm glad you signed in. Thank you. Yeah, anybody else, if you did not, I think everybody signed in, but if you didn't, be sure and sign in. So try and think of it that way. Now, there are times, I mean, I think both Isabel and Bia said at some point, we don't always agree on everything. Of course we don't. No, we don't. You're right. But I'm suggesting the fundamental social things, I think we generally do agree on. And the people who don't, sometimes if you really search it out with them, then you'll find out that what they'll ultimately admit to is, I just don't care. That's not the same thing as disagreement. But there are things. And what is a fundamental thing, an important thing on which you would say that's pretty significant in a society? We'd say, see, now that's an example of where not everybody agrees. And the issue of right and wrong, where there's a significant disagreement that can characterize a society.
Well, anything controversial like abortion or, you know.
Well, is that really true though? I mean, is it really true to say of someone who opposes abortion that they really think that all life is sacred? Because if they do, then why overwhelmingly do people who oppose abortion support capital punishment? Yeah, that, you see what I'm saying? In other words, it also would be incorrect to say that everyone who supports the right of a woman to make that choice, it doesn't necessarily mean they think that abortion is a good thing. They may feel very uneasy about it. They may think, gee, I wish that decision didn't have to be made. That's a hard decision. But you know what? The government shouldn't make it. That is a fundamental human decision. See, I don't think that's so much a disagreement on whether or not something is right or wrong in its purest sense. I think it's more about how we should do something like that, how something like that happens. And a lot of it is because we don't understand the real nature of creation of life any more than we do the inevitability of death. We just, we can say we do, but we don't. Okay. That's one that usually comes up. And I'm not saying that there aren't people who disagree on that. I think the more meaningful distinction with respect to what Locke is saying, if we're in the 21st century, is no, what we disagree on is whether or not it should be public policy. It's not the same as saying, gee, I wish people would not make this or that decision. It's just like saying, well, if you're going to make that, then you're the one's going to have to live with that, and you find a place to put that where you understand it, then I'm not going to stop you from doing that. As opposed to someone who says, no, you kill any human life, that's murder. Well, then that means we can't wage war, because it's all murder. I mean, you gotta be consistent one way or another. If killing is wrong, then it's wrong all the time. So that's what I mean when I say, I don't think it's so much a question of agreeing or disagreeing on whether, in this case, terminating potential or absolute life is right or wrong. I don't think that's the issue. I think that the more imperative issue is, how are we going to live? Okay, but what else? What else? Because that's a fundamental life. That's like arguing that murder is right or wrong, or that killing someone is right or wrong. Even something like murder, right? Murder is not Murder is a legal term, okay, for unjustified deliberate homicide, usually. Otherwise, it's manslaughter or whatever, right? But everyone knows it's wrong. What else? Well, something that really, where we really disagree, because the implication earlier was, well, the implication was there are a lot of things that people just don't agree on in terms of what's right or wrong. I'm going to suggest to you, I don't think there really are. I really don't. I'm trying to argue from that point of view, okay? But you tell me, you convince me that there are a lot of things on which people just fundamentally disagree on the basis of whether they are right or wrong. Do you think, for example, that there is widespread disagreement on whether or not governments should tax? Widespread disagreement where it's a real split between those who say it's right and those who say it's wrong, because I don't think history would support you. I mean, we know from Machiavelli that, remember, one of Machiavelli's concerns was, you know what, if you spend all the money of the principality, you're going to have to go out and get it from the people. Okay, they may not like that. On the other hand, feudalism worked on the basis of people understanding, here, you can have some of my harvest, a tax, in return for which you will help protect me and you will give me sanctuary in an emergency, right? That's a way of paying a tax. Religions use what's called tithing, okay? You take a certain amount of your income and you give it to the church in exchange for their protection, spiritual and otherwise. So we've had taxation of one kind or another since we've had settled societies. I don't think there's fundamental disagreement on whether it's right or wrong. The disagreements are on who and how much and what should be done with the revenues. Those are disagreements, but they're not fundamental. They're very nuanced. Okay, but they're not the absolute right or wrong. I don't think you can say, you know, unless you're just living in another world, it's always wrong to tax people. Tax is theft. No, it's not. It's not. It's not theft. It's nonsense. Okay. I mean, if I shoot you, you're dead. If I tax you, you're not broke. Poor people don't pay taxes unless there are sales taxes, and then they do, or cigarette taxes, and then they do. That's why those are called regressive taxes. They tend to punish people at the lower end of the economy more than wealthy people. That's why a lot of a sales tax will have a cap. Anything over $10,000 isn't taxed. Well, that's only going to affect rich people. Why can't they pay the full tax for the things they buy that cost $1 million? Well, because they don't have to, because they are powerful. Again, you're not helping me understand this fundamental disagreement kind of stuff that people have about what's right and what's wrong. How often do you hear people essentially say, for example, well, morality is personal? No, it's not. You know when you've done something wrong. You know how you know? Because you know other people will think it's wrong. That's not personal. When you feel shame, shame's not personal. Shame is social. When you feel guilt, that's social. You realize you violated someone's trust, or at least you believe you have, right? When you feel shame, you feel that you have been diminished in the sight of others. We're social animals. You know you've done wrong, or you believe you've done wrong, right? I think that that's largely shared, isn't it? You're catching me like arguing both sides of something here because nobody's saying anything. Remember, I warned you on about the first or second day of class. If I'm talking a lot, it's bad because it means you're bored and I'm wasting your time.
I think it's more that at least for me, I can't come up with anything. Like I'm trying here, but I can't come up with an example that.
Damn it, Jason! Then you've let us down, man, and you should be
I
ashamed.
am very sorry. Just kill me.
Yeah, there you go. There can't be anything wrong about that.
No, not at all.
No, but that's the thing, isn't it? You start thinking about it and you think, well, God, maybe it's something else. That's okay. If you're thinking, that's good, because what we're doing is questioning a common assumption. Well, we're just going to disagree on a lot of things. No, you're not. It's just a question of whether or not you care. Why do you think that part of secularization, for example, this trend toward sort of moving away from religion as the explanatory variable, is about increasing tolerance. Okay? Part of tolerance is, it's not that we disagree, it's that we do things differently. In other words, if you're a Catholic and someone else is a Protestant, you don't disagree on the existence of God. You may not even really disagree on the way that you observe your belief in God or externalize your faith. You just have a way of doing it that's comfortable for you. That's not necessarily a fundamental disagreement. Only when you weaponize that, when you give it political valence or something like that, like with Ireland historically, where you have, the 6 counties in the north that are disproportionately Protestant in what is otherwise a deeply and profoundly Catholic society. Okay, yeah, then you get some problems. But the only reason those problems exist is because people gave those differences power and meaning. They politicized them. They politicized religion. There have been surprisingly few wars that were actually fought over religion. If you think about like the 30 Years' War, the termination of which was the creation of, at least on paper, what the modern nation state should look like. Okay, part of that war was about religion, but it wasn't differences in religion. It was the degree to which a country could or could not choose its own religion for its people. That was worth fighting for 30 years. Because what it meant, it was about the sovereignty of countries. It wasn't about whether or not there was a God or whether or not sin was bad. That's not what it was about. It's not like there were a bunch of atheists who put on, armor and went around killing believers. That has never happened, unless you count the Soviet Union. I guess you could argue that, except that we know that the Russian Orthodox Church didn't go away; it just went underground. But you know what I'm saying? In other words, religion seldom really causes wars. Differences in religious belief are not common causes of war, despite what a lot of atheists will say. But they're really good at sustaining mobilization for war, because most people don't want to fight. And you've got to give them something that they understand for which they would be willing to fight. And sometimes religion can be that thing. But, it's like saying, well, there's something about Islam that just makes people go to war. No, it doesn't. No, it doesn't. Last time I checked, there was no prominent Islamic country involved in World War II. But there are a lot of Christian countries. So they weren't fighting over religion. So go away with that idea. So in terms of Locke, though, what he's saying is the problem is everyone's not always guided by reason. Even if you disagree, it's not always reasonable to do anything about it. Again, the importance of tolerance. But the problem is, according to Locke at least, seems to be we just don't always follow our reason. We're not always guided by that. So what he suggests is that's why human beings mutually agree to enter into these civil societies, these societies under law. And they create something called a social contract. Okay? And then the idea of a social contract is it's a mutually agreed upon bargain that people make within a society. And it doesn't mean, well, as long as you do everything my way, I'll agree to it. But if we do anything your way, then I'm done. You can't do that. That's not a social contract. That would personalize it. So what you do, you have to give up certain things in order to be in a civil society, in order to be in a society under law. Now, one of the things about, living in the state of nature is because we are guided by reason and because we're, in his mind, created by a perfect creator spirit, right? And we're endowed by that perfect creator with this perfect capacity to reason, even though we don't always use it perfectly. That gives us rights because it's not reasonable to threaten anyone in their life or their health or their property. Then those things are protected by nature. That is by nature's law. So that's what's meant when you say it's a natural law, and those are natural rights. They derive from that natural law of reason. It's not reasonable for me to take things from you. It's not reasonable for me without cause to just harm you. It's not reasonable for me to kill you, not without cause, okay? And so then the challenge is, when you leave the state of nature, do you give those natural rights up? When you go into a government, what natural rights do you retain and which ones do you give up? So that's what I'd like you to take a look at on the state of nature. What do you give up when you go into the state of nature, create the social contract, and create a civil government? What do you give up? Right? So that's what I want you to look for before Wednesday. Are there any questions? You guys are tired.
I have a question.
Yeah.
When we're talking about like what you have to give up to enter into like a government or whatever,
To leave the state of nature. Yeah. Yes.
wouldn't that vary a lot depending on the form of society that you
See
create?
what Locke says first. See what Locke says first. Okay. In other words, there's an argument that he makes. We'll understand that first. Then what we'll do is what you're implying, which is, do you really do that in the same way for every government under law? Which is a perfectly legitimate question. But as you've been a couple times during the term, you're a little bit ahead of us. So you got to let us catch up to you. But that's a great question. I want you to start thinking about that. You know, remember I've mentioned this a couple of times, but it becomes very important as we get closer to those philosophies that are more like the way we live. Is I'm not asking you to accept that these people are correct, but before we can critique them, we have to make sure that we understand what it is they're arguing. Then we can decide. That's why so many people out of hand will, in the United States in particular, will dismiss socialism, or they'll dismiss Karl Marx, or they'll dismiss whoever and say, well, that's garbage because, well, why? Well, because I've always been taught that it's garbage. You know, I know it can be done because I grew up during the Cold War. I should have had every reason to hate Marxism, Leninism, to hate the Soviet Union, to hate anything that wasn't capitalism, because that was the constant domestic propaganda environment within which I grew up. Somehow, though, that didn't take, okay, because I'm as skeptical about capitalism as I am about socialism, which is pretty damn skeptical, okay? But it's not very useful to think that one's good and one's bad. The question is more like what we were just talking about. Do they both involve the same degree of the protection of rights and liberties? Do they both afford the same kind of liberty? Is the individual as important under socialism as under your kind of liberal capitalism like the United States or Britain, or the most obvious examples of that? Part of that is what we'll deal with is, does this mean that in some societies the individual is less important than the good of the collective? Because then they'd be more predisposed for socialism. It gets at this question, though, of whether or not we really give up the same things in the same way in every kind of civil government. But first, we'll see what Locke says, because we're going to spend some time on this. We're going to spend some time critiquing this, and then I'm going to, assuming that we have time and we can move through this literature pretty expeditiously, we're going to look at some anarchists, we're going to look at some Marxists, we're going to look at different thinkers, maybe even some fascists, and figure, well, why did one thing they all have in common? They all abandoned liberalism. They all abandoned Locke's assumptions about a free society in various ways, either by wanting to make it considerably less governmental oriented than it was and less capitalist, or by really closing down on individual freedom until ultimately you have something like an authoritarian dictatorship, a fascist society, whatever it is. You know, there are a lot of different ways that people have formed governments. And, you know, the implication of Zara's question here is, did that mean that they all left the state of nature giving up the same things in the same way? The easy answer to that is no, they did not. And that becomes important as we move down the road a little bit. Does that make sense what I'm saying? In other words, let's first make sure we understand what the key assumptions of liberalism are, at least according to Locke. But then absolutely, let's go back and critique them and build on that question. That's when this stuff really begins to become more profound in terms of what we can learn, when we know it well enough that we can take it apart and critique it. Okay? But that's a great question. I think that's probably a good place to stop, unless you have other questions. But does that make sense what he's asking, the question that he's asking? It's a very important question. You know, we don't all leave the state of nature the same way, I think is the implication. Yeah, it's a very profound observation. And it's the kind of thinking that I like to hear us doing in here. That's good. All right, so if you do nothing else before Wednesday, please read chapter 2 on the state of nature. If that's as far as you get, that's okay. And then we'll go back. You'll tell me all about what you read in chapter 2 and what it means to you and how you understand it. And then we'll skip the state of war and we'll go straight into slavery because it's a short chapter and it's completely grim. And you know, that's the way I roll. All right. Yeah, I'm trying real hard to say nothing about the election. By the way, there is, for those of you who might be interested, because this is, I don't think this is going to be anything like settled by tomorrow night. I and a couple of other faculty members were asked if we would offer a chance for people to get online and talk about the election a little bit. And there, you've probably already gotten some notification of this, but there's a thing on Wednesday, I think it's 5 to 6, and an hour is not nearly enough time. So I don't know what we're going to get done, but anyway, we're going to be doing a little, insofar as we can, a little sort of postmortem on the election as it's unfolding and what it might mean. And because remember the things to look at, it's not just the presidency, it's whether or not Republicans continue to control the Senate, what happens in state houses. There's a lot of things going on that could change things significantly. Okay, so you know, you'll have plenty of chance to talk about the election. Oh God. Anyway, I think I'll leave that right there. All right, anything else?
How would we find out, or how would we be able to get onto that, whatever you're doing there with the election?
Well, I had heard that was going to be sent out as an email to everybody, but if you're curious, I have the Zoom link for it. I don't know that I can't just send that to you if you email me. I can send that. Again, I can't promise anything. You know, I have no idea what anybody has in mind or what they think is going to do. Let's see. I have a question regarding politics in general. Is philosophy a part of it? The easy answer would be yes, it is. Yeah. Yeah. That is, there is still that part of even politics that wants to get at some sort of knowable, understandable truth. To that extent, philosophy can matter. I mean, obviously, that's what Plato and Aristotle both thought they were doing. They thought they were telling you the truth. And, you know, Machiavelli in his way, unless those scholars are correct who suggest that what he was doing was an elaborate parody, right? If we can just assume, if we could take him at his word in The Prince, then he's trying to convince potential leaders, you have to do these unpleasant things. Yeah. So philosophy, yeah, philosophy is involved in politics. It's not very much involved in political parties. There's very little philosophy there. That's increasingly just about contesting and winning elections. Has almost nothing to do with, or has less to do than I think a lot of us would like, with trying to make the country better. Yeah. Okay, anything else? Let's see, I'm planning to attend a community thing that sounds like what you're talking about on Tuesday. Well, you're a stronger man than I am. Yeah. Yeah, I'm going to be stuck in front of this computer probably from about 1 in the afternoon until probably for 12 hours, you know, trying to make sense of things as they come in. I'm really not looking. Normally it's really kind of fun. You know, I really kind of dig it. This time I'm not having any fun with this at all. I'm really not. I'll just be honest with you. I just kind of want it to be, you know, in my rearview mirror, but I can't pretend though that I'm not fascinated by it. I really am, you know. All right. Anything else? Okay. Chapter 2. If nothing else, chapter 2. Otherwise, I'll speak severely to you. Ooh, that's really good. Ooh, scary. Oh no, the little old man gonna speak severely to me. You know, I'll do it worse than that. I'll speak severely to you, and then I'll just hang up on all of you. Go out and have a beer. You know, I'll waste my time. Right? All right. Anyway, take it easy. Take it easy on election day. Don't let it get to you. We can talk about it on Wednesday if you want to. Really, try not to let it get to you. Okay, you're gonna survive this. All right. I'll see you on Wednesday.
Thank
Yeah.
you.
Thank you.
Thank you.